Thank you for having me today. I was saying to Skip a little bit earlier that all of us who've been fortunate enough to have worked for President Clinton or do work for President Clinton feel like we're grads of the Clinton School. So it's nice to be back here and giving something back. And I can tell you from still being involved in political and public policy circles that the reputation of this school and what Skip has done in the last few years is remarkable, given the short time the school's around. So I want to thank Nick DePapa and Skip for having me today, and all of you for indulging me as we talk about something that's kind of fun. You've probably heard this before, but to everyone in college here, research indicates that you're getting your news from fake news shows instead of real news shows. And it's kind of funny. And the real media has picked up on this as a way to try to explain what the influence of shows like The Daily Show and The Colbert Report and Real Time with Bill Maher have on the political process. And because they've made it more important, newsmakers, politicians, and people with causes have also seen it as more important. And I think the question about this is this all a joke? Meaning, is this really true? And so today, I want to talk a little bit about the factors behind this and explore this phenomenon, and also give some practical advice for those of you who are going to go work in politics or work in the media in terms of how to incorporate and think about comedy in relation to what you do. It is true that in this new downloadable, on-demand world, people are getting their news from more sources than ever. I think that people are also getting their perspective from comedians. In fact, the New York Times said that for better or worse, much of the electorate has come to regard satire as less a response to politics than its ideal delivery system. And as I mentioned, because of this, newsmakers are lobbying actually to go on shows like The Daily Show to get their message out. If you add in everything that's happening on the web, as Lukeman mentioned, YouTube is even in Jordan, and all of the outlets that you can get smart political satire, including blogs, it's hard to argue that political comedy is not a full-fledged member of the Fourth Estate. There's only one problem with this theory, is that the people who make the shows don't agree. They just think that they're doing comedy, and they really stick to this notion. They'll tell you that they're mocking the media, and all they're doing is trying to present what's funny every day. And every time that the media assigns a deeper meaning to what they do, the more successful their satire is. As Lukeman mentioned, I've worked on both sides of this issue, so I've seen it from when we worked in the White House and doing communication strategy about how to take advantage of these shows, and also working on the shows in some, I won't say trying to trick people to come on the shows, but it's evolved to a point where people now want to go on these shows, and over recent history, that wasn't always true. And we'll take a look at that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, some reasons why Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert and Bill Maher and others have been such an influential part of the political and opinion landscape, and as I mentioned, what that means for all of you who will be hopefully working in these fields. And I'm also going to focus on television. There's a lot out there. There's obviously political films and political comedy on the web, but this is going to be a comparison of what's happening on television and a discussion about that. Before we talk about why The Daily Show, why we've gotten to the place where The Daily Show is so influential, I want to show you some clips from the past few elections where candidates were going on these shows to try to advance their cause. And I want to do this mostly because I look smarter analyzing what happened than I do about predicting the future. You may remember some of these moments from the past few years. I wanted to point out before you watch them, they all have two things in common. The shows booked these candidates purely because they thought it would be funny, and the candidates went on these shows because they thought it would advance their causes. So let's take a look at the clip. I had nothing to do with any of those, but thank you. The obvious question when you watch these clips, or at least I feel like the obvious question is, why would you do that to yourself? If you were a candidate for, in many of these clips, the cases of the highest office in the land, why would you embarrass yourself like that? Why would you go talk about your bikini wax on national television if you're trying to have people take you seriously and envision you as the governor? And the answer is that in this new media landscape, there's so much out there. There's so many news outlets, newspapers, news magazines, the web, that people who run political campaigns often look at comedy as a way to break through the clutter and reach people where they live. It's a strategy much like you would employ if you're promoting a movie. To make a sports analogy about it, it's like throwing over the heads of the defense. If the mainstream media is the defense who are going to, question you and take a critical approach to what you're doing, most of these shows give you a very friendly, soft, open forum so people can, in the candidates' minds, get to see the real you and like you better. It's, as I mentioned, the same way you would promote a movie, and much less risky than, say, going on Tim Russert on Sundays. But this doesn't always work. If you look at these clips, what do you notice? Well, only 2 of the people in these clips actually won what they were running for, George Bush and Arnold Schwarzenegger. And that somehow contradicts with the notion that comedy shows are liberal from the standpoint that, the comedians are liberal, the audiences tend to be liberal, and if you're a conservative politician going on those shows, you may not be going into a friendly audience. But they did well on those shows, and they got elected, not because of those shows, but because of everything else they were doing, just like the Democrat candidates who went on those shows did well on those shows and didn't get elected, not for anything else that they were doing, not for other reasons, not for these shows. So that brings up the question, are these shows as influential as the media would make them out to be? Because if you look at what everybody says about The Daily Show, it is, in some cases considered the most influential forum to be on if you're running for office or promoting a book or advancing a cause. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we got to the point where people consider The Daily Show so influential. There are a couple misconceptions about these shows. It may surprise you to know that The Daily Show only averages about 1 million viewers a night. By comparison, O'Reilly and Keith Olbermann average a little more than that every night. And what's a remarkable comparison is that the evening news, the evening network news, which has been left for dead, still averages combined 23 million viewers a night, with the lowest of those shows averaging about 6 million viewers, or 6 times as many people watch the lowest rated 6:30 network news show as do The Daily Show every night. So in terms of pure numbers, it's not even an argument what reaches more people. But yet The Daily Show and the Colbert Report, Real Time, still seem to have more influence. And it's hard to imagine now because these shows are so popular, but broadcasters and advertisers haven't always embraced this as a good idea. It seemed sort of obvious now, why didn't someone come up with The Daily Show a long time ago? In fact, there's been an evolution through television history to get to this point, and I think understanding why this show has such an outsized influence in comparison to the number of viewers it has, it's important to look back and see how we got here. I know it's not all students in the audience today, so some of you probably do remember what television was like in the 60s, but for those of you who don't, political comedy on TV and political comedy in general in the 60s was a relatively new thing. Stand-up comedy as we know it today, being provocative and edgy and taking on topical issues, really didn't start till the late 50s or early 60s and sort of mirrored the evolution of rock and roll. And at the time, comics like Mort Saul and Lenny Bruce and Dick Gregory couldn't even perform in a mainstream club or on TV. They were banished to jazz clubs. They were sort of considered these underground, counterculture icons, but certainly not mainstream. In fact, Dick Gregory sort of broke the color barrier. He was sort of the Jackie Robinson of comedy, and he was a brilliant, brilliant comic, and the only person that would let him play his club was Hugh Hefner, and he let him play the Playboy Club in Chicago, and that broke the color barrier and let him go on to, it made it safe for him to go to other clubs until he actually became outspoken. And now we expect our comics today to be outspoken, but back then, being outspoken could get you kicked off TV and get you kicked out of clubs, and that happened to Dick Gregory and Mort Saul and Lenny Bruce and later on Bill Hicks. So if you have a chance, and if you like comedy, if you like The Daily Show and what the comics do today, I really urge you to go back and try to find some old tapes and audio recordings of what they did. And you'll see what they did, given the time they lived in, was much more provocative and much more meaningful than what we're seeing today. And Jon Stewart and Bill Maher are the latest in a long line, along with Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle, of stand-ups who have really thought and known that comedy is our sharpest form of social commentary, and that to really sort of poke fun at the system is a valuable and entertaining part of what they do. Also in the 60s in the television landscape, two of the most popular shows were Laugh-In and the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. Now, you've probably heard of these, but they started out as mainstream variety shows, sort of very safe, like Leno or Carson. And as the war in Vietnam evolved and the civil rights movement went along, they became more and more provocative and more pointed in their social commentary, to the point that, particularly with the Smothers Brothers, they got kicked off and canceled from CBS, even though, and if you can imagine this, they were the highest rated television show at the time. They were making a lot of money for CBS, and because they did political comedy that the South Park kids would find tame, CBS kicked them off the air. Another interesting part that happened in the 60s, another thing that happened in the 60s was that Richard Nixon went on Laugh-In. And it's hard to imagine now, we think that President Clinton, for his grasp of entertainment and comedy, was one of the first people to embrace going on shows like Johnny Carson, when he went on to try to resurrect his image after his long-winded 1988 nomination speech of Mike Dukakis. And you probably remember that he famously sat down with an egg timer and put it on Johnny Carson's desk to poke fun at himself. And then later in the '92 campaign, famously went on Arsenio. But way back in the 60s, when these weren't acceptable platforms to go on, Richard Nixon knew he had a lot of work to do to resurrect his image. He had lost the presidential election to John Kennedy. He was trying to resurrect his image to run for governor. He went on Laugh-In and let them throw a pie in his face, and then said their famous catchphrase, which was, "Sock it to me." He actually said, "Sock it to me," and then they socked it to him by throwing a pie in his face. So if you can imagine, as far as these candidates are going now in these clips, can you imagine President Bush going on a show and, letting them throw a pie in his face? So we've evolved a lot in terms of the landscape, but some of the things that we're seeing aren't particularly new. When we got to the 70s and 80s, Saturday Night Live and MASH were two of the most successful shows on television. And many of you remember Chevy Chase started Weekend Update, which was really the precursor to any of the shows that we see now. And he would mock Gerald Ford mercilessly every week, not on his policies, but just on his nimbleness and not being able to, he tripped a few times in public, and this former All-American athlete from Michigan was branded by Chevy Chase as a bumbler. And that, in part, Gerald Ford later said, he felt translated to voters feeling less affection for him and maybe contributing to him losing the election of Carter. MASH was one of the longest running sitcoms in history, and it was a very thinly veiled indictment of what was happening in the Vietnam War. And of course it was funny. And it was funny, it was following the exploits of the characters as they struggled with what their daily existence in a war zone. So first and foremost, any of these shows had to be funny. And the message was more subtle and grew out of the comedy. And I think as I go around and talk to people and working on the entertainment side of the business, hearing from the political people, that's a big misassumption they have about any of these shows leading up to The Daily Show, is that they take a point of view first. They don't. They try to be funny first, and if they succeed in being funny, if they succeed in doing satire that resonates about current events or politics or issues like the war, then they feel like they've done their job. But if they're not funny, then it doesn't work. A little bit later, in the early 1990s, Politically Incorrect appeared, and it was a pretty revolutionary idea at the time. They were going to take the McLaughlin Group, which for all its boisterousness was really a sober discussion of the issues, put a comedian at the helm of this group, mix in actors and musicians and pro athletes and politicians, and try to get them to debate the issues in a really raucous way. And at first, newsmakers in the political community stayed away from this show because it was just too dangerous. Why would you ever put yourself in a situation where an actor or another comic who has nothing to lose could, pin you down on an issue? And when it launched on Comedy Central first, before going to ABC, the only news network, and it was really still sort of in its infancy, was CNN. And so political comedy and news coverage were still very much separate beasts. But then things started to change in the mid-90s when the cable news universe exploded and MSNBC came on the scene and Fox, was that these networks acted like entertainment networks. Even though they were covering news, they had to get ratings and they had to satisfy advertisers. And one of the ways to do this was to create shows like Crossfire and Hardball that were really combative. And they produced these shows. This is something most people don't know or most people don't know if you haven't worked in the media business, is that these shows are produced and booked to create conflict. And it might sound obvious, but sometimes it's not always the most important news that's getting discussed. It's what's going to make for the most engaging conflict and entertaining debate. So these shows started acting more like politically incorrect. And so they became part of what everyone's come to call the 24-hour spin cycle. And to create these conflicts, the people on the show started really digging into their positions. So rather than having a thoughtful meet the press kind of discussion about issues, they turned into scream fests, for lack of a better word, and there was a lot of headbutting. And the viewing public at first really gravitated toward this, but then they started seeing everything as spin. So at the same time, these shows looked more like entertainment shows, like Politically Incorrect, and shows like Politically Incorrect, and then later The Daily Show and Colbert Report and the late night shows became more, they became viewed as by newsmakers and politicians as more acceptable forums to go on, because they weren't getting their point across on a show like Hardball. Maybe they could get their point across on these other shows. So where Politically Incorrect started here and McLaughlin Group started here, a few years later, they all looked the same. They had the same people on these shows, they had the same pundits, same newsmakers, they were talking about the same issues. They were taking a different point of view. And that's something, again, that's been lost as we look at the influence of these shows on the media landscape, is that still to this day, the comedy shows, their mission is to be funny. The news shows are to try to make news, and even though they seem very much one and the same. I talked a little bit about how these shows are produced, and I thought it might be instructive to take you behind the scenes a little bit to talk about how the things get selected to go on the air. So if you watch The Daily Show or Leno or Letterman or Conan, all these shows sort of have a similar structure, which is in the morning, 10 o'clock in the morning, the writers get together with the host and they pitch ideas. And they pitch ideas that they think are going to be funny. They look at the news and they decide what can they make an entertaining show out of it. And The Daily Show itself is structured, there are three parts to the structure. There's the news, or what you would see on a late night show like Leno is the monologue, and that's what the writers spend most of their time developing during the day. There are package pieces, fake news pieces from correspondents pretending to be reporters in a war zone or in Washington. And then there's an interview. And the interviews are often booked months and months in advance. And again, that's where people come on to promote a movie or a book or a politician to advance their candidacy. And having worked on these shows, something that's interesting and a piece of advice for when you go out into this world is that the shows often get called by press secretaries and asking people to book their congressional member. And when you say, well, why do you want to come on The Daily Show or why do you want to come on Real Time? Their answer is, well, my boss is funny. And if you think about it, these shows already have a comedian. They're not looking to add a second comic. And it's a big misconception. So if you're working in this world, if you go out and you're working for a candidate or in government or for a nonprofit and you think that these shows are a good place to go promote what you're doing, really give it a critical look, because it's not about who's coming on to be funny. There is a certain amount of will you play along with the host, but it's a point of view. They're looking for someone who has a point of view that their audience would be interested in. So it's not about, can you come on and tell the best jokes? And, in fact, most of the things that you saw in those clips were written for those comics by the writers on the show. In some cases, they were written by their campaign staff, but they were tweaked by the writers. Or if you see people go on Letterman and do the top 10 list, it's shaped by the writers of the show. This is a very staged piece of comedy. It's not that they're funny on their own. And it's just something to remember. There's also a big distinction between what these shows do. The late night shows are general entertainment shows interested in reaching the biggest possible audience. That would be Leno and Letterman. specifically on cable, Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, and Bill Maher do very different things. Jon Stewart was a stand-up comic that designed a show to poke fun at the media and mock how they cover stories as opposed to mocking politics. And when he does the interviews on the show, that's really Jon and his own natural curiosity interviewing the person. He tries not to he tries to be balanced, try not to let a political agenda come out, but it really is shaped by how he feels about things. And that's why you're seeing lately, he's been very interested in authors, knowing that that's one group of artists that has been largely underrepresented on TV lately. And between The Daily Show and what Oprah did a few years ago, they feel like they're giving people who have something to say a chance to go out and say it and talk about their work that they're not otherwise getting. So he's not always about politics, but he's about things that he finds interesting. Stephen Colbert is a much, much different case and has obviously been in the news a lot lately. Stephen is playing a character, and his character is an egomaniacal, right-wing talk show host. And so everything he's doing and everything he does, he keeps in character. A few years ago, one of the things I did for Comedy Central is they were launching the Colbert Report, and they were looking for ways to promote him. And so we put together his appearance at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And leading up to the dinner, there was a tremendous amount of buzz, and tickets were selling like hotcakes. And after the dinner, it still, I think, is one of the #1 downloads on iTunes. But when we were sitting in the dinner, I thought I was going to lose my job because it was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster. And most of it, there were a lot of factors that went into it, but one of the reasons was most people who came to the dinner were aware of Colbert, but they thought he was doing stand-up. They didn't realize that he was playing a character. So his criticism of President Bush was his character's criticism. That wasn't Stephen, it was the Stephen Colbert character. And that's also behind very much what he's doing now in running for president. This is his way of mocking the system. He's often said that good comedy is a response to the status quo. And what he sees as the status quo of candidates who go out and try out a book as a way to test their candidacy and gin up interest for their book by speculating that they might run is the same thing you're seeing through his trying to get on the South Carolina ballot here. And ironically, he's getting some traction. Some of you may remember this too, going back to historically to the 60s, but he's not the first television comic to actually run for president. Pat Paulson, who was a big part of the Smothers Brothers, entered the 68 race, and he was very serious about doing it. He ran 5 more times. In fact, in 1996, I think in one of the primaries, I want to say it was North Dakota, he came in second to Bob Dole in the Republican primary, and in New Hampshire, I think he got 1% of the vote in that primary. So there have been comics that have done this before, but the media landscape now through YouTube and blogs has made what Stephen's doing sort of a cause celeb. The thing is when you get into politics too, is both the left and the right know that these forums are a more effective way now to communicate their issues and causes, and so they want to reach savvy viewers, sophisticated viewers that are sort of tuning out the clutter of regular news media coverage and approach them in a different way. And the reason this works, the reason The Daily Show works after you've looked at the history of these shows, is simply that audiences trust comedians more to not necessarily to deliver their news, but to cut through the spin that you hear on these other shows and present the opinion and a way to think about it in a way that's more honest. And it's honest because comedy has to be honest to be funny. You have to recognize some truth within the joke to laugh. And so they've become a much more trusted delivery system and a much more trusted, venue for looking at politics. And candidates, and as I said, all sorts of groups across politics are trying to take advantage of that. I mentioned when you go to work for candidates, that's from the show side. The show side, they want these candidates on the show because why wouldn't you? If they're willing to come on and make a fool of themselves, and you're delivering something to the audience and you get a chance to ask the people who could be leaders of the country questions, why wouldn't you do it? And it makes for good ratings and it makes for good comedy. But if you're working on the other side, like we did, you have to carefully consider what you're getting out of it when you put your candidate on a show. And some candidates, particularly President Clinton, was very, very good at understanding what comedy could do and how it could help his image. And Senator Clinton has done the same thing. And I wanted to show a clip that we did last year for a thing called the Legislative Correspondents Association in New York, which is a New York version of the White House Correspondents' Dinner. It's the people who cover politics and news in New York. And this is called No Public Schedule. So you can see her sense of humor coming through there. And this had a very specific purpose. This, and most of the jokes, I'm sure, you maybe didn't get a lot of them, but they were geared toward the year in political coverage in New York and some very specific things that happened. And she did it to sort of deal with some of the issues that were out there as she was running for re-election. One was she running for president? She was Ed Cox, who was in there, who was Nixon's son-in-law, was going to take her on and decided not to. Whether she had a good relationship with Mike Bloomberg, and whether she could poke fun at herself. And this was a very, very effective piece in trying to address many of those questions. And so if you're advising a candidate and you think that your candidate is up to the task of using comedy to advance their agenda or poke fun at themselves, it's a worthwhile thing to do. You just have to be very careful about the forms that they do it in and going on the shows, being careful about what you're getting into. I just wanted to remind everyone and conclude here before I take some questions that these shows, when you're watching them, their whole goal is to be funny. They're not trying to be arbiters of politics or issues. They're just trying to do comedy. But looking ahead, we can certainly expect that these shows are going to be a more influential part of the process in 2008. You're already seeing it. You're seeing the candidates going on The Daily Show, on Leno, on Letterman. Even sometimes they're letting their images be used on South Park or The Simpsons. They're really doing everything they can to reach every voter and, in some sense, reach you where you live, sort of when you're not expecting it. And it may not work. Barack Obama did The Daily Show recently, and Hillary hasn't, and it hasn't made a difference in the polls. But he is doing everything, and the people who go on these shows feel like they're doing everything they can to reach people. So is all of this good or bad for political discourse? Well, I think in a polarized world, particularly a polarized political world, comedy can really be the place that people find common ground. And as I mentioned, there's the perception that comics, like filmmakers, tend to be liberal, but most comics will tell you that they're really equal opportunity offenders. If you haven't seen it, there's a show called Blue Collar TV that's made up of what the industry terms red state comics that appeal mostly to the same demographic that country music appeals to, or that's what they thought. They've really had ratings and popularity and selling out shows that rival what The Daily Show or even some of the sitcoms are doing. So it's true that there's not a liberal ideology, there's just an ideology and a point of view that they need to be funny. And that's because good comedy is based on recognizable truths that are often uncomfortable and insightful, otherwise you wouldn't laugh at them. And as I said, in the public's mind, that makes them more honest arbiters of what you're hearing. It's also useful and sad to look back last year at what happened with the riots across the world in response to the Danish cartoons making fun of Muhammad. There, people actually died for using satire to make a social point, where here we expect our comics, and Chris Rock and Bill Maher and Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert, to deconstruct our idols, be they American idols, political, or sacred. So when you're watching the show, The Daily Show this year, or you consider voting for Stephen Colbert for president, ask yourself what these shows say about the media, and don't expect our next president to be the funniest. Thank you very much.